21 years ago, Mark Sullivan and his teenage son Ethan Sullivan disappeared during a routine hike in the Appalachian Mountains, leaving no trace behind. The disappearance plunged Sarah Sullivan into profound depression and the small community of Pine Ridge into total confusion. Police considered various possibilities, accidents, wild animals, even escape, but couldn't solve the case, causing outrage in the family who never lost hope. Sarah Sullivan fought tirelessly for the truth to come to light. Before we continue, subscribe, like the video, and hit the notification bell. This helps the channel bring you more stories like this one. It was a typical October morning in Pine Ridge, Virginia, when Mark Sullivan, 42, decided to take his son Ethan, 15, on a hike through the Appalachian Mountains. Mark was known in the community as a careful man, an Army veteran, experienced trail guide, and devoted father who rarely made reckless decisions. His methodical approach to life had earned him respect among locals who often sought his advice on outdoor activities and survival techniques. Ethan, meanwhile, was a quiet but adventurous teenager who loved exploring nature alongside his father. Unlike many kids his age who preferred video games and social media, Ethan found peace in the wilderness. He had been hiking with Mark since he was 7 years old, and together they had conquered dozens of trails throughout Virginia and neighboring states. Their weekend adventures had become legendary in the family, with Sarah often joking that she was married to 2 mountain men who preferred sleeping under stars to comfortable beds. The plan for that fateful Saturday was simple: a full-day hike on the trail known as Devil's Backbone, a route that Mark had traversed dozens of times over the past decade. It was considered a moderate difficulty trail, well-marked and popular among experienced hikers. Mark had hiked it solo just 3 weeks prior, scouting it for potential hazards or changes in the terrain. Everything had seemed perfectly normal then. Sarah Sullivan remembers preparing sandwiches and water bottles that morning, kissing both of them goodbye at the front door, and saying, "Be careful out there," words that would echo in her mind for the next 21 years. She watched from the kitchen window as Mark loaded their hiking gear into his red Ford pickup truck, the same truck he had bought when Ethan was born, claiming he needed something reliable for family adventures. Mark had told Sarah they would be back by sunset, around 7 p.m. He was meticulous about timing on hikes, always calculating distances, elevation changes, and rest stops with military precision. He carried 2 GPS devices, a compass, emergency flares, and enough supplies for twice the expected duration of any trip. His Army training had instilled in him a respect for preparation that bordered on obsession. When sunset came and went without any sign of them, Sarah felt the first stirrings of genuine worry. Mark never missed deadlines, especially when it came to family commitments. He had promised to help Ethan with a school project that evening, and Mark Sullivan was a man who kept his promises. At 8 p.m. she called Mark's cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. At 9 p.m. she called again. Same result. By 10 p.m. Sarah's worry had transformed into panic. She called the local sheriff's office, explaining that her husband and son were several hours overdue from a hiking trip. The dispatcher, a woman named Betty, who had known the Sullivan family for years, immediately understood the gravity of the situation. Mark's reputation for reliability was well known throughout Pine Ridge. At 11:30 p.m., the first search teams were already being mobilized. Sheriff Tom Bradley, a man with 30 years of experience in mountain rescues, took personal charge of the operation. He knew that in missing person cases, especially in wilderness areas, the first 24 hours were crucial. The Appalachian Mountains were vast and unforgiving, thousands of acres of dense forest, deep ravines, and trails that branched like veins throughout the territory. But what search teams found at the Devil's Backbone trailhead was deeply unsettling. Mark's red pickup truck, perfectly parked at the beginning of the trail, with the keys still in the ignition. The truck was unlocked, Mark's wallet was in the glove compartment, and there were no signs of struggle or foul play. Most disturbing of all, there were no footprints beyond the initial parking area, no indication that father and son had even begun their planned hike. It was as if the mountain had simply swallowed them whole. The first 72 hours after Mark and Ethan Sullivan's disappearance became a whirlwind of frantic activity that transformed the quiet community of Pine Ridge into a major search and rescue operation center. The Rappahannock County Sheriff's Department mobilized every available resource, drawing assistance from neighboring counties and even state authorities who recognized the unusual nature of the case. Sarah Sullivan didn't leave the trailhead for a single night during those first critical days. She set up an improvised camp in the parking lot, serving hot coffee to volunteers and maintaining constant vigil, as if her presence could somehow guide Mark and Ethan back home. "They're alive," she repeated to anyone who would listen, her voice carrying a conviction that seemed to strengthen rather than waver as hours turned into days. "I can feel them out there. A mother knows these things." Sheriff Tom Bradley, a weathered man with 3 decades of experience in mountain rescues, had never encountered a case quite so baffling. He had seen hikers get lost due to overconfidence, injured in falls, or disoriented by sudden weather changes. He had dealt with cases where people deliberately disappeared to escape debts or relationships, but this case defied every pattern he had learned to recognize. "In 30 years of doing this job, you develop an instinct," he told the local press during one of the daily briefings. "Accidents leave traces, broken branches, disturbed soil, personal items dropped along the way. Deliberate disappearances leave clues. Financial preparations, unusual behavior in the days beforehand, conversations that seem significant in retrospect. This case, it was like father and son had simply materialized out of thin air, parked their truck, and then dematerialized again." The search operation expanded rapidly. By the 3rd day, more than 300 volunteers had joined professional rescue teams. The group included local hunters who knew every deer path in the mountains, rock climbers who could access impossible terrain, and amateur radio operators who set up communication networks throughout the search area. Churches throughout the county organized prayer vigils, while local businesses donated food, equipment, and supplies for the extended operation. Helicopters, equipped with thermal imaging cameras, swept the area in grid patterns, searching for heat signatures that might indicate human presence. Bloodhounds brought in from Richmond followed scent trails that seemed to lead nowhere, circling back to the parking lot repeatedly as if confused by some invisible barrier. Professional mountain rescue teams rappelled into ravines and explored cave systems that weren't marked on any official maps. The theories began multiplying as days passed without any solid leads. Some locals speculated about wild animals. Black bears were common in the region during autumn, and there had been reports of increased bear activity that season. A few suggested that Mark might have had hidden financial problems and fled with his son, though this theory was quickly dismissed by anyone who knew the family's stable situation and Mark's character. More disturbing theories emerged from outside the community. Some suggested kidnapping, though no one could explain how kidnappers could have operated on an isolated trail without leaving evidence. Others whispered about drug operations hidden in the mountains, claiming that Mark and Ethan might have stumbled upon something they weren't supposed to see. The community of Pine Ridge found itself divided between hope and resignation. Neighbors organized weekly vigils at the local Methodist church, where Pastor Williams led prayers for the safe return of our lost sheep. Local merchants placed missing person posters with Mark and Ethan's photos in every storefront window. The Pine Ridge Diner became an unofficial headquarters for volunteers, where search strategies were discussed over coffee and desperate theories were shared in hushed conversations. But as weeks transformed into months, the collective energy began to diminish. Professional search teams were gradually reduced, then suspended altogether due to budget constraints and the statistical reality that survival chances in the wilderness decreased dramatically after the first month. Volunteers slowly returned to their normal lives, though many continued to keep an eye out during their own outdoor activities. Sarah Sullivan, however, never wavered in her determination. As professional resources dwindled, she used the family's life savings to hire private investigators with experience in missing person cases. She organized her own weekend search parties, recruiting anyone willing to spend their Saturdays combing through unexplored sections of the mountains. She maintained a website with updated information about the case, hoping that someone somewhere might recognize Mark and Ethan, or remember seeing something unusual. Her marriage to Mark had been built on 20 years of mutual trust and shared dreams. They had met in college, bonded over their love of outdoor adventures, and built a life together that centered around family, community, and the natural beauty of Virginia's mountains. Sarah refused to believe that the man who had never missed a single one of Ethan's school plays would abandon his family without explanation. Time, however, proved to be hope's cruelest enemy. 5 years had passed since the disappearance, and Pine Ridge had learned to live with the unresolved mystery of the Sullivan family. The case had been officially reclassified as cold, filed away in a dusty box in the sheriff's department basement, alongside other unsolved cases that had gradually faded from public consciousness. For most people, Mark and Ethan Sullivan had become just another tragic story that locals whispered about in bar conversations and newcomers learned about through gossip. For Sarah Sullivan, every single day remained a battle against forgetting. She had transformed Ethan's bedroom into an improvised command center that would have impressed military strategists. Maps of the region covered every wall, marked with red circles indicating areas already searched, and yellow pins marking locations that still needed exploration. Filing boxes contained hundreds of police reports, witness testimonies, and correspondence with law enforcement agencies from neighboring states. A large bulletin board tracked weather patterns, seasonal changes, and wildlife migration routes that might have affected Mark and Ethan's movements. Sarah's work as a librarian at Pine Ridge Elementary had become mechanical and distant. She performed her duties efficiently, but colleagues noticed the faraway look in her eyes, the way she compulsively checked her cell phone during breaks, waiting for a call that never came. During lunch periods, she typed tirelessly on online forums dedicated to missing persons, sharing Mark and Ethan's story with strangers who offered theories and empty condolences from across the country. Her physical appearance had begun to reflect the emotional toll of her obsession. The woman who had once been known for her carefully styled hair and professionally pressed clothing now wore the same 3 outfits in rotation, her hair often unwashed for days, her attention focused entirely on the next search expedition rather than personal maintenance. Friends and family members expressed concern, but Sarah interpreted their worry as lack of faith in Mark and Ethan's survival. Sheriff Tom Bradley had retired after 35 years of service, replaced by a younger man from Richmond, who viewed the Sullivan case as an inherited burden rather than an active investigation. "Look, Mrs. Sullivan," the new sheriff had said during one of her monthly visits to the department, "sometimes people just don't want to be found. Maybe it's time to consider moving forward with your life. Your husband and son, if they're still alive, wouldn't want you to sacrifice your health and happiness this way. Moving forward." The words sounded like blasphemy to Sarah's ears. How do you move forward when half your soul has disappeared without explanation? How do you accept that the love of your life and your only child have simply dissolved into thin air? How do you rebuild a future when the foundation of your past has been ripped away without warning or closure? The suggestion that Mark and Ethan might not want to be found particularly infuriated Sarah. She knew her husband better than anyone else in the world. She knew that he was incapable of the kind of deception that would be required to fake their disappearance. She knew that Ethan, despite his teenage independence, was deeply attached to his family and would never willingly put her through such anguish. In 2010, 6 years after the disappearance, Sarah made a decision that shocked everyone who knew her. She sold the family home where she had lived for 15 years and moved to a small cabin in the foothills near Devil's Backbone Trail. The cabin was primitive, with basic electricity and a wood-burning stove for heat, but it was only 3 miles from the spot where Mark's truck had been found. "If they come back," she explained to worried neighbors who tried to talk her out of the move, "I want to be close enough to hear them calling for help. I want to be the first person they see when they make it out of those mountains." The cabin became Sarah's base of operations for increasingly elaborate search expeditions. She had acquired topographical maps going back to the 1800s, studying how the landscape might have changed over time. She researched Native American trail systems that predated modern hiking routes. She even contacted geologists to understand cave formations and underground water systems that might provide shelter for survivors. Local hikers began reporting sightings of a solitary woman with a large backpack and determined expression, always walking alone, always heading deeper into the wilderness areas that other people avoided. Some tried to approach her, concerned for her safety, but Sarah had developed an ability to disappear into the forest as completely as her missing family members. The mountain had taken her family, and now Sarah was surrendering her own life to the same mountains, in a silent vigil that would stretch across years. 15 years had passed since that October morning when Mark and Ethan Sullivan had driven away from their home for the last time, and Sarah Sullivan had become a local legend, not the kind that inspires admiration, but the kind that provokes worried whispers and uncomfortable silences. The 58-year-old woman, who had once been a respected elementary school librarian, with carefully maintained appearance and professional demeanor, had transformed into an almost ghostly figure who wandered the Appalachian trails with a weathered backpack and eyes that had witnessed too much pain. Her cabin near Devil's Backbone Trail had evolved into a disturbing shrine to obsession and loss. Every available surface was covered with maps, photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes in a script that had become progressively tighter and more desperate over the years. Sarah had mapped every square meter of the mountains within a 50-kilometer radius, marking specific rocks, distinctive trees, and geological formations that might conceal secrets or provide clues to her family's fate. The maps weren't simply geographical references, they were archaeological records of Sarah's mental state. Different colored pins marked locations where she had found interesting objects, a torn piece of fabric that might have come from hiking clothes, animal bones that could indicate predator activity, unusual rock formations that might shelter survivors. Each discovery was photographed, catalogued, and cross-referenced with weather data and seasonal patterns that Sarah had been meticulously tracking for over a decade. She had developed elaborate theories that she documented in notebooks that accumulated like evidence of a mind refusing to accept the inexplicable. Perhaps Mark and Ethan had discovered an unmapped cave system and become trapped in underground passages. Maybe they had encountered an illegal drug operation and been silenced by criminals who couldn't risk exposure. Perhaps a religious cult hiding in the mountains had captured them for purposes too disturbing to contemplate. Each theory was supported by carefully researched evidence. Sarah had studied local crime statistics, identifying patterns of drug trafficking and illegal activities in the region. She had researched historical accounts of hermits and isolationist communities that had allegedly established settlements deep in the Appalachian wilderness. She had even contacted experts on cult behavior, trying to understand how such groups might operate in remote areas. The few friends who still maintained contact with Sarah were alarmed by her physical transformation. She had lost 30 pounds over the years, her hair had gone completely grey, and her hands were always covered with cuts and scratches from her obsessive hikes through dense undergrowth. When she spoke about Mark and Ethan, and it was virtually the only subject she could discuss coherently, her eyes gained a disturbing intensity that made people feel uncomfortable and eager to escape her presence. Sarah's financial situation had deteriorated significantly as she spent her savings on private investigators, specialized equipment, and extended search expeditions. She had sold most of her possessions, keeping only essential items and the growing collection of maps and documents related to her search. Her diet consisted mainly of canned goods and dried foods that she could carry on hiking trips, and her cabin lacked many basic comforts that she had once considered necessities. In 2019, 15 years after the disappearance, Sarah made a discovery that reignited her hope in a dangerously intense way. During one of her explorations in a particularly remote section of the mountains, she found a hiking boot partially buried under decomposing leaves, approximately 5 kilometers from the main trail. The boot was in surprisingly good condition for something that had supposedly been exposed to the elements for 15 years, with the leather still intact and the sole showing minimal wear. Sarah immediately recognized the brand and style. It was identical to the boots that Mark had been wearing on the day they disappeared. She carefully photographed the boot from every angle, measured its size, and documented the exact GPS coordinates of the discovery. Then she carefully excavated the surrounding area, searching for additional evidence that might have been buried alongside the boot. She found nothing else at that location, but the discovery reinvigorated her belief that the mountains were still hiding crucial evidence. Sarah carried the boot to the sheriff's department, certain that she had finally found the proof that would restart official investigation into her family's disappearance. She demanded DNA testing, forensic analysis, and a renewed search of the area where the boot had been discovered. The forensic tests were inconclusive and frustrating. The boot had not belonged to Mark or Ethan Sullivan, and there wasn't sufficient DNA material to establish any connection to the case. Laboratory analysis suggested that the boot had been in the forest for no more than 2 or 3 years, meaning it was completely unrelated to the 15-year-old disappearance. But for Sarah, the boot represented proof that the mountains were still yielding secrets that hadn't been discovered. If a single boot could remain hidden for years before being found, what else might the mountains be concealing in their depths? 20 years. 2 complete decades since Mark and Ethan Sullivan had vanished without a trace, and Pine Ridge had finally learned not to mention the subject in Sarah's presence. The community had developed a kind of unspoken protocol. When Sarah appeared at the local grocery store or pharmacy, people were polite, but avoided prolonged eye contact. She had become a living reminder of something that everyone preferred to forget, a walking monument to loss that made others uncomfortable with their own good fortune. The case had become part of local folklore, transformed into an urban legend, told by teenagers during camping trips, and whispered by newcomers who wanted to understand the strange undercurrents they sensed in Pine Ridge's seemingly peaceful atmosphere. Some versions suggested that Mark had discovered something in the mountains that he shouldn't have seen and had been silenced by powerful forces. Other, more fantastical theories spoke of dimensional portals or supernatural creatures inhabiting the depths of the Appalachian wilderness. Sarah, now 60 years old, had developed an almost ritualistic daily routine that the few remaining locals who remembered her original life found both heartbreaking and disturbing. Every morning at exactly 7 a.m., she walked to the spot where Mark's truck had been found 20 years earlier. She would stand there for precisely 15 minutes, 1 minute for each year of Ethan's life, in absolute silence, as if listening for echoes of voices that no one else could hear. After this morning ritual, Sarah would set off for different sections of the trail system, always carrying a military whistle that Mark had given her years before their marriage. 3 long blasts, pause, 3 long blasts, a signal that she repeated every 30 minutes throughout her hikes, waiting for a response that never came. Local wildlife had become accustomed to the sound, and some hikers reported that the whistle blasts had become as much a part of the mountain's natural soundscape as bird calls and wind through pine trees. The new sheriff, Daniel Murphy, was a man in his 40s who had arrived from Richmond 5 years earlier with fresh perspective and genuine sympathy for Sarah's situation. Unlike his predecessor, he didn't view the Sullivan case as an inherited burden, but as a mystery that deserved respect and continued attention. He had reviewed all the files, re-interviewed some witnesses, and even consulted with missing persons specialists from other states who had dealt with similar cases. "What bothers me most," Sheriff Murphy confided to his wife one evening, "is the complete absence of evidence. In 20 years of law enforcement, I've never seen anything quite like it. Even the most carefully planned disappearances leave some kind of trace. Financial records, witness sightings, communication attempts. It's like father and son simply ceased to exist the moment they parked that truck." Murphy had tried several times to convince Sarah to speak with grief counselors or therapists who specialized in helping families cope with unresolved loss. He had researched support groups for families of missing persons and even offered to arrange meetings with other families who had found ways to move forward despite never getting answers. But Sarah consistently rejected all offers of psychological help, insisting that therapy was for people who had given up hope. In October 2024, exactly 20 years after the disappearance, the community organized a memorial vigil, not officially to declare Mark and Ethan dead, but to offer some kind of closure for Sarah and recognition of the community's shared loss. The event was held at the Pine Ridge Methodist Church, where Pastor Williams had led prayers for the Sullivan family's safe return for 2 decades. More than 200 people attended the vigil, including some who had participated in the original search efforts and others who had moved to Pine Ridge in the years since and had only heard stories about the case. Candles were lit, prayers were offered, and several community members shared memories of Mark and Ethan from the time before their disappearance. Sarah attended the vigil, standing in the back of the church throughout the entire ceremony, without speaking or acknowledging the condolences offered by other attendees. When Pastor Williams invited her to say a few words about her family, she simply shook her head. After the formal ceremony ended, as people were filing out of the church, Sarah finally spoke in a voice that carried clearly through the quiet space. "They're not dead. I would know if they were dead. A mother knows these things. They're still out there somewhere, and I'm going to find them." It was a declaration that made people wonder whether a mother's faith could be stronger than reality, or whether there was something in the mountains that no one had yet understood. If this case has already captivated you, leave a like. It helps the channel bring more stories like this and helps the Sullivan story reach more people. March 2025. 21 years after the Sullivan disappearance, an unexpected event was about to reopen wounds that Pine Ridge had spent decades trying to heal, and challenge everything that the community thought they knew about the fate of Mark and Ethan Sullivan. Jake Morrison, a 28-year-old nature photographer who had recently moved to the region to pursue his passion for wilderness photography, was using a drone to capture aerial images of the mountains for an artistic project about rural Virginia landscapes. It was a clear Saturday morning in early spring, and he had chosen a relatively unexplored area of the Appalachians, approximately 8 kilometers from Devil's Backbone Trail, further than any search team had ventured during the original investigations. Jake had been drawn to the area by its pristine beauty and the way morning light filtered through the dense canopy of oak and pine trees. He was particularly interested in capturing images that showed the contrast between the ancient geological formations and the newer growth forest that had reclaimed areas once cleared by early settlers. His drone was equipped with a high-resolution camera capable of detecting details that would be invisible from ground level. The drone was flying at approximately 60 meters altitude when Jake noticed something unusual in the images being transmitted to his tablet. Between the dense tree cover, there appeared to be geometric shapes that contrasted sharply with the organic chaos of the forest. Initially, Jake assumed he might be looking at the remains of an old hunter's cabin or perhaps abandoned mining equipment from Virginia's colonial period. Intrigued by the possibility of photographing historical ruins, Jake programmed the drone to fly lower and capture high-resolution images of the anomaly. What he saw on his screen made his blood run cold and his hands shake as he struggled to maintain control of the aircraft. These weren't artificial structures in any conventional sense. They were bones. Specifically, what appeared to be human skeletal remains, arranged deliberately in a small circular clearing, as if they had been placed there intentionally by someone who wanted them to be found, eventually. Jake Morrison wasn't easily frightened. His photography career had taken him to war zones and natural disaster areas where he had documented human suffering and tragedy. But there was something profoundly disturbing about this discovery that went beyond simple shock at finding human remains. The skeletons appeared to be positioned in what could only be described as ceremonial arrangements, and even through the grainy drone footage, it was possible to distinguish that one skeleton was significantly smaller than the other. Father and son. The realization hit Jake like a physical blow. He didn't know the detailed history of the Sullivan case. He had moved to Pine Ridge only 6 months earlier and had been too focused on his photography work to learn much about local history, but he instinctively understood that he had stumbled upon something monumentally important. The isolated location, the 2 skeletons of obviously different ages, the careful arrangement that suggested human intervention rather than natural death. All of these factors pointed to a discovery that would change everything. Jake immediately landed the drone and spent several minutes staring at the images on his tablet, trying to process what he had found. He took screenshots from multiple angles, recorded the exact GPS coordinates, and made detailed notes about the time, weather conditions, and camera settings used to capture the footage. His photographer's instincts told him that documentation would be crucial for whatever investigation would inevitably follow. At 2:30 p.m. on that Saturday afternoon, Jake contacted the Rappahannock County Sheriff's Department, reporting the precise GPS coordinates of his discovery and immediately emailing the drone footage to the department's investigation unit. He explained that he was a professional photographer, provided his credentials and contact information, and emphasized that he had not disturbed the site in any way beyond aerial observation. Sheriff Daniel Murphy received the call while he was at home, initially assuming it was another of the occasional false alarms they received about the Sullivan case. Over the years, the department had investigated dozens of reported sightings, found objects, and conspiracy theories related to the disappearance. Most turned out to be cases of mistaken identity, wishful thinking, or deliberate hoaxes by people seeking attention. But when Sheriff Murphy opened the email attachment and saw Jake's drone footage, his expression changed completely. The images were clear enough to show details that left no room for doubt. These were human skeletal remains, and their positioning suggested that they had been deliberately arranged rather than scattered by natural forces or animal activity. After 21 years of investigating the Sullivan disappearance, Murphy recognized that this could be the breakthrough they had all been waiting for. Murphy immediately called his chief deputy and the state crime scene investigation unit, requesting full forensic support for what could potentially be a major discovery. Then, after 21 minutes of hesitation and internal debate, he made the phone call that he had both hoped and dreaded making for years. He called Sarah Sullivan. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of hope, apprehension, and deep respect for the woman who had never stopped searching, "I need you to come to the department as soon as possible. We may have found something." After 21 years of silence, the mountains were finally ready to reveal their secrets. The forensic investigation team arrived at the remote clearing early the following morning, led by Dr. Amanda Richards, a forensic anthropologist from the Virginia State Crime Lab who had worked on dozens of missing persons cases throughout her 15-year career. The location was exactly as Jake Morrison had documented, a small circular opening in the dense forest, so perfectly concealed by the overhead canopy that it would have been virtually impossible to discover from ground level. The team included crime scene photographers, evidence technicians, a forensic pathologist, and 2 graduate students in anthropology who would assist with the careful excavation and cataloging process. Sheriff Murphy had also requested the presence of a FBI liaison, given the high-profile nature of the case and the possibility that it might involve federal jurisdiction if evidence of foul play was discovered. What the team found challenged every assumption that had been made about the Sullivan case over the past 2 decades. The skeletal remains were in remarkable condition for bones that had supposedly been exposed to Virginia's harsh weather cycles for more than 20 years. More disturbing still, they had been carefully arranged in specific positions that clearly indicated human intervention. The larger skeleton was positioned in a fetal position, as if sleeping peacefully, while the smaller skeleton was arranged as if being protectively embraced by the first. There were no obvious signs of trauma to the bones, no evidence of violence, and no indication of predation by wild animals. Dr. Richards had seen hundreds of crime scenes involving human remains, but this arrangement was unlike anything in her professional experience. "Someone took great care in positioning these remains," she explained to Sheriff Murphy. "This wasn't random scattering by animals or natural decomposition. These bodies were deliberately placed in these positions, probably years after death occurred elsewhere." Sarah Sullivan had insisted on being present during the excavation, despite Sheriff Murphy's concerns about her emotional well-being and the potential impact of witnessing the recovery of what might be her family's remains. She maintained a respectful distance as required by investigation protocols, but her eyes never left the forensic team's work. When Dr. Richards confirmed that the skeletal remains belonged to an adult male and a teenage boy, Sarah didn't cry or show visible emotion. Instead, she simply whispered, "I knew they were here somewhere. I always knew." The most significant discoveries were yet to come. Alongside the skeletal remains, the team found personal belongings that had been perfectly preserved by some combination of environmental factors and deliberate protection. Mark Sullivan's leather wallet was intact, with documents and family photographs still legible after more than 2 decades. His watch and the anniversary gift from Sarah was found carefully placed near what would have been his wrist position. Ethan's school backpack was discovered a few meters away, containing textbooks, notebooks, and personal items that provided heartbreaking glimpses into the life of a 15-year-old boy who had disappeared in the middle of his sophomore year of high school. His biology notebook contained detailed drawings of local wildlife, and his history textbook was bookmarked at a chapter about Virginia's colonial period. But the most shocking discovery was a leather-bound journal, written in Mark Sullivan's unmistakable handwriting, which documented the final months of his and Ethan's lives in excruciating detail. The journal had been wrapped in plastic and placed in a waterproof container, suggesting that Mark had taken great care to preserve it for eventual discovery. The first entries in the journal, dated just days after their disappearance, revealed a truth that no one could have imagined. Mark and Ethan hadn't died on October 15, 2004. They had survived in the wilderness for almost 4 months, constructing improvised shelters and sustaining themselves on wild berries, edible roots, and small animals that Mark was able to trap using techniques he had learned during his military service. The journal entries painted a picture of incredible resourcefulness and determination. Mark had managed to create a relatively comfortable campsite in a cave system that wasn't marked on any official maps. He had established water collection systems, food storage methods, and even a primitive calendar to track the passage of time. Most importantly, he had maintained detailed records of their attempts to find their way back to civilization. The entries revealed that Mark had been seriously injured during their first week in the wilderness, a fall that had fractured his leg and caused internal injuries that he carefully concealed from Ethan to avoid frightening his son. Despite his injuries, Mark had made numerous attempts to lead them back to the main trail, but each effort had been thwarted by his deteriorating physical condition and the confusing maze of unmarked paths that crisscrossed the remote area where they had become lost. The journal documented their daily struggles with increasing desperation as autumn turned to winter. Mark wrote about his efforts to keep Ethan's spirits up, inventing games and storytelling sessions to distract from their increasingly dire situation. He described how they celebrated Ethan's 16th birthday in November with a cake made from berries and honey they had found in a wild beehive. As winter approached, the entries became shorter and more desperate. Mark wrote about the challenge of maintaining body heat in their improvised shelter, the difficulty of finding food as natural sources became scarce, and his growing certainty that they might not survive until spring. Throughout it all, he continued to express love for Sarah and regret that they might never see her again. The final entries, written in increasingly shaky handwriting, documented Mark's acknowledgement that his health was failing and his desperate attempts to prepare Ethan for survival alone. The last entry, dated February 12, 2005, simply read, "Ethan is getting weaker every day. I don't think I can protect him much longer. If someone finds this journal, please tell Sarah that we tried to come home every single day. Tell her that we never stopped loving her and that we never stopped believing she would find us eventually." The truth was more heartbreaking than any theory that had been imagined. Father and son had spent months fighting to survive, just a few kilometers from home, but had never been able to find their way back to safety. The news of the discovery of Mark and Ethan Sullivan's remains spread through Pine Ridge like wildfire through drought-stricken forest. After 21 years of speculation, conspiracy theories, and gradually fading hope, the truth was simultaneously simpler and more devastating than anyone had imagined. The community that had spent over 2 decades wondering what had happened to the Sullivan family now had to confront the reality of their prolonged suffering and ultimate fate. Sarah Sullivan spent the following week at the sheriff's department, reading and rereading every page of Mark's journal, with the intensity of someone trying to memorize sacred text. The words her husband had written painted a portrait of desperate courage and paternal love that simultaneously destroyed and comforted her. Mark had done everything humanly possible to keep Ethan comfortable and hopeful, even when he knew their chances of survival were diminishing with each passing day. The journal revealed details that explained why the original search teams had never found them, despite the extensive efforts that had been made during the first months after their disappearance. In the initial weeks after becoming lost, Mark and Ethan had made several attempts to return to the main trail, but Mark's leg injury forced frequent rest stops and detours that led them progressively further from the correct path. They had heard search helicopters multiple times, but the dense tree canopy made them invisible from the air, and their weakened voices couldn't carry far enough to attract attention. Dr. Amanda Richards presented her complete forensic report 10 days after the discovery. The cause of death for both Mark and Ethan had been hypothermia and malnutrition. They had simply succumbed to the brutal winter of 2004-2005, when their bodies could no longer maintain the energy needed for survival. There was no evidence of foul play, traumatic accident, or any of the darker theories that had circulated through the community for decades. It was, in the clinical language of the official report, a tragedy of natural circumstances exacerbated by injury and disorientation. The report also addressed the mysterious arrangement of the skeletal remains that had been discovered by Jake Morrison's drone. Forensic analysis suggested that the bodies had been moved and carefully positioned several years after death, probably by someone who had discovered them in their original location and had taken great care to treat the remains with respect and dignity. The identity of this person remained unknown, but the arrangement suggested someone with deep emotional connection to the deceased. The community of Pine Ridge reacted to the discovery with a complex mixture of relief, guilt, and renewed grief. Many residents found themselves questioning whether the original search efforts could have been more extensive, whether the search perimeter should have been expanded beyond the immediate trail area, whether persistence for a few more weeks might have saved 2 lives. The knowledge that Mark and Ethan had survived for months while rescue teams searched nearby areas was particularly difficult for former volunteers to accept. Local churches organized memorial services to provide the community with opportunities to process their collective grief and guilt. Pastor Williams of the Pine Ridge Methodist Church delivered a sermon about the limits of human understanding and the importance of honoring those who had been lost, rather than dwelling on what might have been done differently. Mark and Ethan Sullivan fought for survival with every breath in their bodies, he told the congregation. Our job now is to ensure that their memory inspires us to be better neighbors, more persistent in our care for each other, and more grateful for the families we still have. Sheriff Daniel Murphy publicly acknowledged that the original search efforts, while extensive by the standards of 2004, had been limited by the technology and resources available at the time. If this case happened today, he told reporters, we would have had access to more sophisticated aerial surveillance, better communication systems, and expanded search protocols that might have led to a different outcome. But we cannot change the past. We can only learn from it and do better in the future. Sarah Sullivan faced a different kind of torment than the community's collective guilt. On one hand, she finally had the answers she had sought for more than 2 decades. Mark and Ethan hadn't abandoned her, hadn't been victims of violent crime, and hadn't suffered for years in captivity. They had fought bravely for survival and had never stopped loving her or hoping to return home. On the other hand, she now knew that they had spent months just kilometers from safety, struggling to survive while she slept in her warm bed and went about her daily routines. I walked through those mountains thousands of times over the years, she told Sheriff Murphy during one of their conversations. How is it possible that I never got close to them? How is it possible that they were so near and I never felt their presence? I always believed that I would know somehow if they were nearby and needed help. The psychological impact of learning that her obsessive searches had been geographically close, but chronologically too late, was almost unbearable. Sarah had to confront the possibility that if she had been more persistent in the early months, if she had pushed search teams to expand their perimeter, if she had trusted her instincts and explored more remote areas, she might have found Mark and Ethan while they were still alive. Dr. Richards, who had observed Sarah's reaction throughout the investigation, recommended professional counseling to help her process the complex emotions associated with finally learning the truth. Survivor guilt is common in families of missing persons, she explained. The fact that Sarah dedicated her life to searching for her family doesn't make her responsible for not finding them sooner. Sometimes the mountains keep their secrets until they're ready to reveal them. The truth had finally emerged from 2 decades of silence, but it brought as much pain as relief, as many new questions as answers. The funeral for Mark and Ethan Sullivan took place on a crisp April morning in 2025, 21 years after their disappearance, and exactly 2 months after Jake Morrison's drone had captured the images that finally brought them home. The Pine Ridge Methodist Church was filled beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the parking lot, where speakers had been set up to accommodate the overflow crowd. The service attracted attendees from far beyond Pine Ridge's small community. Former search and rescue volunteers traveled from across Virginia to pay their respects. FBI agents who had consulted on the case over the years came to witness its conclusion. Journalists who had covered the story during its most intense periods returned to document its resolution. Most significantly, families of other missing persons came to honor the Sullivans and to find hope in the fact that some mysteries do eventually find resolution. Sarah Sullivan sat in the front pew, flanked by her sister and a few close friends who had remained loyal throughout her decades-long vigil. She looked smaller and more fragile than she had in years, as if finally allowing herself to grieve had released some essential tension that had been holding her together. In her hands, she clutched Mark's leather journal, which had become her most precious possession, proof that her husband and son had never stopped fighting to return to her. Pastor Williams delivered a eulogy that attempted to capture both the tragedy of the Sullivan family's fate and the inspiration of their love for each other. He read selected passages from Mark's journal, sharing the father's expressions of love for his family and his determination to protect his son even in their darkest moments. Mark and Ethan Sullivan teach us that love doesn't end with death, he told the assembled mourners. Their love for Sarah and her love for them sustained hope for 21 years and ultimately brought them home. The service included musical selections that had been meaningful to the Sullivan family. A local choir performed Amazing Grace, which had been played at Mark and Sarah's wedding. Ethan's former classmates, now adults with families of their own, sang a song that he had performed in the high school talent show just months before his disappearance. The music filled the church with memories of happier times, when the Sullivan family had been complete and their future had seemed unlimited. Following the church service, a procession of more than 300 vehicles made its way to Pine Ridge Cemetery, where Mark and Ethan were laid to rest in adjoining plots that overlooked the Appalachian Mountains, where they had spent their final months. The headstone, paid for by community donations, bore a simple inscription: Mark Sullivan, 1962-2005, and Ethan Sullivan, 1989-2005, beloved husband and father, beloved son and brother. Together, forever in the mountains they loved. After the burial ceremony, many attendees gathered at the Pine Ridge Community Center for a reception where people shared memories of Mark and Ethan from before their disappearance. Former neighbors talked about Mark's willingness to help with home repairs and yard work. Ethan's teachers remembered his curiosity about nature and his talent for drawing wildlife. Friends recalled family camping trips and holiday celebrations when the Sullivans had been an integral part of the community's social fabric. Sarah spoke publicly for the first time in years during the reception. Her voice was quiet but clear as she thanked the community for never giving up hope and for supporting her search efforts even when they seemed futile. Mark and Ethan would be amazed to know how many people cared about them, she said. They would be grateful that so many strangers were willing to spend their time looking for two people they had never met. That kindness means everything to me. She also addressed the question that many people were afraid to ask directly. What would she do now that her 21-year search had finally ended? I don't know how to live a normal life anymore, Sarah admitted. Searching for Mark and Ethan became my purpose, my identity, my reason for getting up every morning. Now I have to learn how to be Sarah Sullivan again, not just the woman whose family disappeared. In the weeks following the funeral, Sarah began the difficult process of rebuilding a life that had been on hold for more than 2 decades. She donated most of her maps, search equipment, and investigation materials to organizations that help families of missing persons. She kept Mark's journal, a few photographs, and some personal items that had been recovered with the remains, but she packed away the elaborate command center that had dominated her cabin for years. The cabin itself was too isolated and too filled with painful memories for Sarah to continue living there. With the help of her sister and a few close friends, she found a small apartment in Pine Ridge proper, close enough to the cemetery that she could visit Mark and Ethan's grave regularly, but far enough from the mountains that she wouldn't be constantly reminded of their suffering. Sheriff Daniel Murphy established a scholarship fund in Mark and Ethan Sullivan's memory, designed to provide outdoor education opportunities for local teenagers. The fund would support wilderness survival training, environmental science programs, and hiking safety courses, ensuring that their tragic fate might prevent similar losses in the future. The mystery of who had moved and carefully arranged Mark and Ethan's remains was never solved, despite extensive investigation. No evidence was found to identify the person who had discovered their original location and had taken such care to position them respectfully. Some people theorized that it might have been another lost hiker who had found the bodies years earlier and had been too traumatized to report the discovery. Others suggested it might have been someone who had known the Sullivan family and had felt compelled to provide them with dignity in death. Sarah chose to believe that whoever had moved Mark and Ethan's remains had acted out of love and respect. Someone cared enough to treat them gently, she said. Someone made sure they were together and peaceful. I'm grateful to that person, whoever they are. They gave my family the dignity that the mountains had taken away. Jake Morrison, the photographer whose drone discovery had finally solved the case, donated his equipment and time to help other families search for missing persons in Virginia's wilderness areas. His aerial photography skills had proven invaluable in locating remains that might never have been found through ground searches alone, and he wanted to use his abilities to bring closure to other families facing similar anguish. As summer arrived in Pine Ridge, life slowly returned to something resembling normalcy. The media attention faded, the journalists moved on to other stories, and the community began to process the Sullivan case as history rather than ongoing mystery. But the impact of their story would remain part of Pine Ridge's identity, a reminder that some questions do eventually find answers, that love can endure decades of uncertainty, and that even the most painful truths can bring a kind of peace. Sarah Sullivan, now 61 years old, began attending grief counseling sessions and slowly reconnecting with friends who had tried to support her throughout her years of obsessive searching. The counseling helped her understand that her dedication to finding Mark and Ethan hadn't been unhealthy or futile. It had been the natural response of a mother and wife who refused to abandon hope when everyone else had given up. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the grief counselor recommended by Dr. Richards, specialized in helping families cope with traumatic loss and complicated grief. During their sessions, she helped Sarah understand that her 21 years of searching hadn't been wasted time, but rather a necessary journey that had ultimately brought her family home. "You never stopped loving them," Dr. Hendricks explained. "You never stopped believing in them. That kind of faith is rare and precious even when it comes at great personal cost." Sarah also began volunteering with the National Center for Missing Persons, using her experience to help other families navigate the complex emotions and practical challenges of having a missing loved one. Her story became a source of hope for families in similar situations, proof that cases could be solved even after decades of silence, that persistence could eventually be rewarded, and that closure was possible even in the most seemingly hopeless circumstances. On the first anniversary of finding Mark and Ethan's remains, Sarah returned to the clearing where Jake Morrison's drone had made its historic discovery. She brought flowers, wildflowers that she had picked from the same species that Mark had written about in his journal, flowers that had helped sustain them during their final months. She spent an hour in quiet reflection, reading passages from Mark's journal and feeling closer to her family than she had in 21 years. The clearing had been left undisturbed after the forensic investigation concluded, and it had begun to return to its natural state. New growth was filling the spaces where the investigation team had worked, and the area was slowly being reclaimed by the forest ecosystem. Sarah found comfort in the idea that this place, which had held such tragedy, was becoming part of the natural cycle of death and rebirth that characterized the Appalachian wilderness. Pine Ridge established an annual memorial hike in Mark and Ethan Sullivan's honor, led by Sheriff Murphy, and designed to promote hiking safety and wilderness awareness. The hike followed the Devil's Backbone Trail where their journey had begun, but it also included educational stops where participants learned about survival techniques, emergency communication, and the importance of proper preparation for outdoor adventures. Sarah participated in the first memorial hike, her first time on the trail system in over a year. Walking the familiar paths with dozens of community members, she felt a sense of closure that had been missing during her solitary searches. The mountains that had taken her family and consumed her life for 2 decades no longer seemed hostile or threatening. They were simply part of the natural world, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure, deserving of respect, but not fear. As she walked the trail where Mark and Ethan's adventure had begun, Sarah reflected on the lessons their story might offer to others, the importance of preparation and communication when venturing into wilderness areas, the value of never giving up hope, even when hope seems irrational, the power of community support during times of crisis, the need to balance persistence with self-care when dealing with traumatic loss. The case had also prompted changes in search and rescue protocols throughout Virginia. New guidelines required expanded search perimeters for missing hikers, better coordination between agencies, and more sophisticated use of aerial surveillance technology. The Sullivan Protocol, as it came to be known, ensured that future search efforts would benefit from the lessons learned during the investigation of their disappearance. Jake Morrison continued to live in Pine Ridge, where he had found both purpose and community through his accidental role in solving the area's most famous mystery. His photography work increasingly focused on documenting the intersection between human stories and natural landscapes, and he maintained the drone surveillance program that helped other families search for missing persons in wilderness areas throughout the region. As autumn returned to Pine Ridge, the same season when Mark and Ethan had first disappeared, Sarah felt ready to begin a new chapter of her life. She had enrolled in classes at a community college, considering a return to library work or possibly training in grief counseling to help others facing similar losses. She had also begun dating occasionally, tentatively exploring the possibility of companionship after decades of emotional isolation. The small apartment she had rented near downtown Pine Ridge was slowly becoming a home, rather than just a place to sleep between searches. She had hung family photographs on the walls, pictures of Mark and Ethan from happier times, images that celebrated their life together rather than mourning their loss. She had also framed one page from Mark's journal, a passage where he had written about his love for Sarah and his confidence that she would live a full and meaningful life, even if he couldn't be part of it. On quiet evenings, Sarah would sit by her window and look toward the mountains that had dominated her life for so long. They were still there, still beautiful and mysterious, but they no longer held power over her future. Mark and Ethan were at rest in Pine Ridge Cemetery, and Sarah Sullivan was finally free to live again. The story of the Sullivan family became part of Pine Ridge's permanent history, a reminder that some mysteries do find resolution, that love can endure decades of uncertainty, and that even the most painful truths can eventually bring peace. Their legacy lived on in the safety protocols that would protect future hikers, in the support systems established for families of missing persons, and in the example of a woman who had refused to give up hope even when hope seemed impossible. In the end, Mark and Ethan Sullivan had come home, not as they had intended 21 years earlier, but in the only way that remained possible. And Sarah Sullivan, after more than 2 decades of searching, had finally found the peace that comes with knowing the truth, no matter how painful that truth might be. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following the story of Mark and Ethan Sullivan. See you in the next video.